The Permanence of Primitive Accumulation, Commodity Fetishism and Social Constitution by Werner Bonefeld, from The Commoner, Issue Number 2, September 2001. Introduction. Over the last decade, there has been an increase in the trafficking of women and children, prostitution of slavery. New markets have emerged in human organs and babies. The proprietors of labor power are confronted not only with the new forms of exploitation, they are also transformed into a saleable resource to be operated on and sold, with babies being produced for export. Some commentators have suggested that we witness the reemergence of conditions of primitive accumulation. These works show clearly that Marx's insight, according to which a great deal of capital, which appears today in the United States without certificate of birth, was yesterday in England, the capitalist blood of children, remains a powerful judgment of contemporary conditions. This essay argues that primitive accumulation describes not just the period of transition that led to the emergence of capitalism. Primitive accumulation is, in fact, the foundation of capitalist social relations, and thus the social constitution through which the exploitation of labor subsists. In other words, contemporary developments of primitive accumulation are not chance developments. The argument then is that primitive accumulation is a permanently reproduced accumulation. It is a condition and presupposition of capital's existence. In short, primitive accumulation is a constantly reproduced accumulation, be it in terms of the renewed separation of new populations from the means of production and subsistence, or in terms of the reproduction of the wage relation and the established relations of capital. The former seeks to bring new workers under the command of capital, and the latter to contain them as an exploitable human resource, the so-called human factor of production. Capitalist social relations rest on the divorce of the mass of the population from the means of production. This divorce is a result of primitive accumulation, and it is the presupposition on which the capitalist exploitation of labor rests. Primitive accumulation, then, is a necessary element of capitalism. Better, it is a presupposition of capital and the result of its reproduction. In short, primitive accumulation is a social constitution of capitalist social relations. Primitive accumulation and capital. Within the Marxist tradition, primitive accumulation is usually seen as a prehistory of capitalism. Capitalism developed out of primitive accumulation, and once capitalism had been established, the history of primitive accumulation, a history of blood and fire where sheep replaced humans during the clearing of estates, is seen to be just that, history. Primitive accumulation, then, is seen as a period of historical transition from pre-capitalist to capitalist social relations. The time-specific systematic character of primitive accumulation refers to the clearing of estates, that is, the separation of labor from the means of production and the natural conditions of labor. Marxist writing on imperialism, especially Luxemburg, implicitly acknowledged that capitalism proper in the imperialist centers depends for its own expanded reproduction on the subjugation of new populations to the capitalist exchange relations. Luxemburg, while not denying the conventional view that primitive accumulation is a distinct period of the dawn of capitalism, accepted, nevertheless, the coincidence of constituted capitalist relations with primitive accumulation. Importantly, however, primitive accumulation was not seen as an original accumulation, but rather it was a consequence of the contradictory logic of capitalism concerning the realization of value extracted from the worker in the form of profit. The accumulation of capital necessitated the opening of new markets in order to realize extracted surplus value in exchange. In this view, then, primitive accumulation derives from the contradictory logic of capitalist accumulation and its crisis. This made it possible for Luxemburg to accept the view that primitive accumulation marks a period of transition to capitalism, and to argue, at least by implication, that primitive accumulation is a feature of the crisis-ridden character of capitalist accumulation. Amin, writing in the 1970s, focuses the issue well. The mechanisms of primitive accumulation do not belong only to the prehistory of capitalism, they are contemporary as well. It is these forms of primitive accumulation, modified but persistent, to the advantage of the center, that form the domain of the theory of accumulation on a world scale. The understanding of primitive accumulation as a mere period of transition fails to see that the divorce of labor from her means of production is not just the historical premise of capitalist social relations, but, importantly, the condition and presupposition of the capitalist exploitation of labor. As Marx put it, quote, "The exchange of labor for labor, seemingly the condition the worker's property, rests on the foundation of the worker's propertylessness." End quote. Capitalist social relations are founded in the separation of labor from the means of production, and this entails that capitalist accumulation rests on the continuously reproduced divorce of labor from her means. In sum, the separation of human purposive productive power from her means is constitutive of the fetishism of commodity form. The following section focuses on this issue. Primitive accumulation and social constitution. Marx's critique of political economy made clear that capital is not a thing, and he argues that the standpoint of capital and wage labor is the same. Capital is not a thing because it is a definite social relationship, and the standpoint of capital and wage labor is the same because both are perverted forms of social reproduction. For Marx, each form, even the most simple form like, for example, the commodity, is already an inversion and causes relations between people to appear as attributes of things. Or more emphatically, each form is a perverted form. The most developed perversion, the constituted fetish of capitalist society, is a relationship of capital to itself, of a thing to itself. The extreme expression of this perversion is interest-bearing capital, the most externalized and most fetish-like form of capital, and the wage, the defining characteristic of wage labor. Labor, wages or price of labor, is an expression that is just as irrational as a yellow logarithm. What then needs to be explained is not the relation between capital and wage labor in its direct and immediate sense, but rather the social constitution upon which this relationship is founded and through which it subsists. In other words, what needs to be explained is why human social productive practice takes the form of capital. Hence, Marx's question, why does this content, human social productive practice, assume that form, the form of capital? This question raises the issue of the social constitution of value. The critical dimension of this insight is this. It is not the unity of living and active humanity with the natural, inorganic conditions of their metabolic exchange with nature, and hence their appropriation of nature, which requires explanation, or as a result of historic process, but rather the separation between these inorganic conditions of human existence and this active existence, a separation which is completely posited only in the relation of wage labor and capital. The class antagonism between capital and labor rests on and subsists through the separation of human social practice from its means. There can be no capitalist accumulation without the continued reproduction of labor's divorce from her conditions. Commodity exchange and money predate capitalist production. For money, however, to be transformed into capital, the prerequisites for capitalist production must exist. The first historical presupposition is the separation of labor from her conditions, and therefore the existence of the means of labor as capital. For Marx, this separation comprises a world's history. Commodity and money are transformed into capital because the worker is compelled to sell his labor itself, to sell directly his labor power, as a commodity, to the owner of the objective conditions of labor. This separation is a prerequisite for the relationship of capital and wage labor in the same way as it is the prerequisite for the transformation of money, or the commodity by which it is represented, into capital. The constitution of human purposeful activity as relations between the things themselves is based on this separation, and once established, obtains as a constitutive presupposition of capitalist social relations. In sum, the separation of labor from her conditions is a precondition of their existence as capital and is the foundation of capitalist production, and is given in capitalist production. Separation means the conditions of work confront labor as alien capital, because the conditions of production are lost to the laborer and have assumed the shape of alien property. The divorce then of human purposeful practice from her conditions and their transformation to the independent force, i.e. capital, transforms the product of labor into a commodity and makes a commodity appear as a product of capital. This entails the materialization of the social features of production and the personification of the material foundations of production. Thus, the capitalist and wage labor are as such merely embodiments, personifications of capital and wage labor. Definite social characteristics stand upon individuals by the process of social production. In this way, primitive accumulation appears suspended in the commodity form. Yet, however suspended, it is a constituted condition of capitalist social relations as relations between things. The presupposition of capital, which originally appeared as the conditions of its becoming, and hence could not spring from its action as capital, now appears as results of its own realization, reality, as posited by it, not as conditions of its arising, but as a result of its presence. In short, primitive accumulation is not just an historical epoch which predates capitalist social relations and from which capital emerged. It entails fundamentally the constitutive presupposition through which a class antagonism between capital and labor subsists. Primitive accumulation is the foundation of capitalist reproduction, and therefore the foundation of wage labor. Primitive accumulation is a centrifugal point around which revolves the specific capitalist mode of existence of labor power, the determination of human purposeful activity in the form of a laboring commodity. While the capitalist production and exchange relations subsist through the commodity form, primitive accumulation is a secret history of the determination of human purposeful practice in the form of a wage laboring commodity. The commodity form subsists through this determination, presupposes it, and, through its form, denies it in the name of abstract equality and freedom. This insight is focused in Marx's critique of fetishism. Quote, "The sum total of the labor of all these private individuals and private groups makes up the aggregate of social labor. Since the producers do not come into social contact with each other until they exchange their products, the specific social character of each producer's labor does not show itself except in the act of exchange. In other words, the labor of the individual asserts itself as a part of the labor of society only by means of the relations which the act of exchange establishes directly between the products and indirectly through them between the producers. To the latter, therefore, the relations connecting the labor of one individual with that of the rest appear not as direct social relations between the individuals at work, but as what they really are, material relations between persons and social relations between things." End quote. The social individual then subsists as such an individual not in an immediate sense, but in a mediated sense. It is mediated through the commodity form. The commodity form poses the totality of bourgeois social relations, and as such a totality posits the basis of the productive practice of all individuals as alienated individuals. The commodity form includes not only the activity of each individual, it is also independent of this connection from the individual. The divorce, then, of labor from its conditions entails not only the complete independence of the individuals from one another, but also their complete dependence on the seemingly impersonal relations established by the commodity form. Thus, the independence of the individual is an illusion, and so more accurately called indifference. Their independence is that of atomized market individuals that are free to collide with one another and to engage in exchange within this freedom. The separation of human activity from its conditions is thus not only the real generation process of capital, but also, once constituted, the real process of the commodity form. In other words, primitive accumulation is suspended in the commodity form as its subterranean condition, constitutive presupposition, and historical basis. The logic of separation entails that the individual capitalist has constantly to expand his capital in order to preserve it, but extend it he cannot, except by means of progressive accumulation. The risk is bankruptcy. Thus, mediated through competition, personified capital is spurred into action, fanatically bent on making value expand itself. The personified capitalist ruthlessly forces the human race to produce for production's sake, increasing the mass of human beings exploited by him. The positing of the result of human labor as a force over and above the social individual, including both the capitalist and wage laborer, and the fanatic bent to make workers work for the sake of work, is found in the separation of labor from its means. The means of production become capital only insofar as they become separated from laborer and confront labor as an independent power. In short, the freedom of labor from her conditions and their transformation to private property entails a capitalist property right to preserve abstract wealth through the sacrifice of human machines on the pyramids of accumulation. The law of private property entails that labor capacity has appropriated for itself only the subjective conditions of necessary labor, the means of subsistence for actively producing labor capacity, i.e., for its reproduction as mere labor capacity separated from the condition of its realization. And it has posited these conditions themselves as things, values which confront it in an alien, commanding personification. The logic of separation is a real process of capital. Indeed, as Marx argues, capital is a separation of the condition of production from the laborer. In sum, Marx does not conceive of capital as a thing in itself, which, endowed with its own objective logic, exchanges itself with itself and that, by doing so, generates profit. Rather, it is conceived as a social relationship between laborer and the conditions of labor, which are rendered independent in relation to labor. The loss of the conditions of labor by the worker is expressed in the fact that these conditions of labor become independent as capital or as things at the disposal of the capitalist. Primitive accumulation, then, is not just a period from which capitalist social relations emerged. Rather, it is a historical act that constitutes the capitalist social relations as a whole. As Marx puts it, the separation forms a conception of capital. The separation of labor from its conditions and the concentration of these in the hands of non-workers posits capital as a perverted form of human social practice where the process of production has mastery over man instead of being controlled by him. Class struggle, then, that freed master from serf and serf from master is constitutive of the relation between capital and labor. Primitive accumulation, then, persists within the capital relation as its constitutive pre-positing action. This action lies at the heart of capital's reproduction. The pre-positing action, the separation of labor from her means, is not the historical result of capital, but its presupposition, a presupposition which renders capital a social production relation in and through the divorce of labor's social productive force from her conditions. In short, class struggle is a logic and historical presupposition for the existence of individual capitalists and workers and the basis on which exploitation rests. The systematic character of primitive accumulation subsists, then, in suspended form through the constitutive relations of capital. The separation is not the result of capital, but its genesis, and it is now posited as the presupposition of capital. It no longer figures as a condition of its historical emergence, but rather as a constitutive presupposition of its fanatic bent on reproducing human relations as relations between commodity owners, and that is as social categories of capitalist reproduction. In short, the separation begins with primitive accumulation, appears as a permanent process in the accumulation and concentration of capital, and expresses itself finally as centralization of existing capitals in a few hands and a deprivation of many of their capital, to which expropriation is now changed. The terror of separation of capitalism's original beginning weighs like a nightmare on the social practice of human purposeful activity. The commodification of human productive power as wage labor means that human social practice confronts its conditions as alien conditions, as conditions of exploitation, and as conditions which appear, and so exist contradictorily, as relations between things. Man is confronted by things. Labor is confronted by its own materialized conditions as alien, independent, self-contained subjects, personifications, in short, as someone else's property, and in this form, as employees and commanders of labor itself, which they appropriate instead of being appropriated by it. The fact that value, whether it exists as money or as commodities, and the further development of the conditions of labor confront the worker as a property of other people, as independent properties, means simply that they confront him as a property of the non-worker, or, at any rate, that as a capitalist he confronts them, the conditions of labor, not as a worker, but as the owner of value, etc., as a subject in which these things possesses their own will, belong to themselves, and are personified as independent forces. Capital presupposes labor as wage labor, and wage labor presupposes capital as capital. Each is a precondition of the other. Every precondition of the social reproduction process is at the same time its result, and every one of its results appears simultaneously as its precondition. All the production relations within which the process moves are therefore just as much as products as they are as conditions. The more one examines its nature as it really is, the more one sees that in the last form it becomes increasingly consolidated, so that independently of the process, these conditions appear to determine it, and their own relations appear to those competing in the process as objective conditions, objective forces, aspects of things, the more so as in the capitalist process, every element, even the simplest, the commodity for example, is already an inversion and causes relations between people to appear as attributes of things and as relations of people to the social attributes of things. The perverted form of value presents, in other words, the mode of existence of human purposeful activity, the form of impersonal relations, conferring on the human being the indignity of an existence, as a personification of things. Thus, concerning the capital-labor relations, the worker produces himself as labor capacity, as well as the capital confronting him. At the same time, the capitalist reproduces himself as capital, as well as a living labor capacity confronting him. Each reproduces itself by reproducing the other, its negation. The capitalist produces labor as alien. Labor produces the product as alien. Once the logic of separation is taken for granted, i.e., once its constituted presupposition is merely assumed as a historical past, the logic of separation can be understood merely in terms of the constituted fetish of capital as a subject that structures the actions of human agents. Orthodox accounts feed on the separation between capitalist structure and human agency. As Horkheimer put it, the separation of Genesis from existence constitutes the blind spots of dogmatic thought. This does not, however, mean that orthodox approaches cannot provide an analysis of value, but they can do so only in terms of labor as a human agency, and in terms of value as embodied labor. This theory of value merely shows that the development of social labor produces either a process of accumulation of value or a complex norm of distribution. In this view, the perverted existence of human relations as relations between things is assumed to be true in practice, and the driving force of capitalist development becomes to be seen as capital itself. Such analytical offerings merely confirm that myth is not a condition merely of former times, but rather that it continues to exercise its domination over thought itself. Hence Marx's insistence on demystification. Neither nations nor history nor capital have made war. History does nothing, does not possess vast wealth, does not fight battles. It is man, rather, the real living man who does all that, who does possess and fight. It is not history that uses man as a means to pursue its ends, as if it were a person apart. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing its ends. Marx's critique of fetishism is fundamentally a critique of unreflected presuppositions. It shows the necessity of capitalist forms in the light of their social constitution. In short, as Marcuse reports, the constitution of the world occurs behind the backs of the individuals, yet it is their work. Without an understanding of the social constitution of the perverted world of capital, there could be no critique of capital without, at the same time, espousing it as performing a useful economic function. This then would lead to the view of capital as a subject that embodies the logic of an abstract market structure whose empirical reality is mediated by class struggle and other social forces. Against this theoretical rationalization of capital as an extra-human force, it is only on the basis of an understanding of separation that a critique of capital can be supplied. This critique breaks into the understanding of capital's exploitation and accumulation as a constituted form and unhinges its constitution and marks a singularity in the dynamics of the antagonism which the law of labor comprehends. The capital relation is a historical product of labor's alienation from itself. Capital is the form assumed by the conditions of labor, and capital's existence rests not just in the exploitation of labor, but rather on the continuous accumulation of capital through the progressive exploitation of labor. Labor's natural power to maintain value and to create new value is commanded by capital in the production process, which is, at the same time, the consumption process of living labor. It is the laborer who constantly produces material, objective wealth, but in the forms of capital, of an alien power that dominates and exploits the laborer, and the capitalist as constantly produces labor power, but in the form of a subjective source of wealth, separate from the objects in and by which it can alone be realized. In short, process the laborer, but is a wage laborer. This incessant reproduction, this perpetuation of the laborer, is a sine qua non of capitalist production. Thus, the contention that capitalist accumulation is not just based on the result of primitive accumulation, but instead that primitive accumulation is a constitutive presupposition of the class antagonism between capital and laborer. As Marx put it, capitalist accumulation merely presents as a continuous process what, in primitive accumulation, appears as a distinct historical process, as the process of the emergence of capital. There will be no capitalist accumulation without the reproduction of labor as object-less free labor. The social constitution of capitalist property rights is the divorce of labor from her means, object-less labor under the command of capital. The presupposition of capitalist social reproduction is the freedom of labor from her condition. This presupposition informs and informs the real movement of capitalist social relations. Capital, fanatically bent on making value expand itself, can do no other than to intensify the division of labor so as to increase its productive power. There is no doubt that the subdivision of labor is the assassination of a people. Yet, it merely consolidates the original separation of labor from its conditions through further and further fragmentations of the social labor process, dismembering man. Still, however, much social labor is fragmented, divided and subdivided. Human cooperation remains a fundamental form of the capitalist mode of production. This cooperation exists against itself in the commodity form that integrates the assassination of a people with the respectful forms of equal and free exchange relations. Labor is and remains the presupposition of capital. Capital cannot liberate itself from labor. It depends on the imposition of necessary labor, the constituent side of surplus value, upon the world's working class. It has to posit necessary labor at the same time as which it has to reduce necessary labor to the utmost in order to increase surplus value. This reduction develops labor's productive power and, at the same time, the real possibility of the realm of freedom. The circumstance that less and less socially necessary labor time is required to produce, for want of a better expression, the necessities of life, limits the realm of necessity and so allows the blossoming of what Marx characterized as the realm of freedom. Within capitalist society, this contradiction can be contained only through force, including not only the destruction of productive capacities, unemployment, worsening conditions, and widespread poverty, but also the destruction of human life through war, ecological disaster, famine, the burning of land, poisoning of water, devastation of communities, the production of babies for profits, the usage of the human body as a commodity to be exchanged or operated on, the industrialization of human production through cloning, etc. The existence of man as a degraded, exploited, debased, forsaken, and enslaved being indicates that capitalist production is not production for humans. It is production through humans. In other words, the value form represents not just an abstraction from the real social individual. It is an abstraction that is true in practice. The universal reduction of all specific human social practice to the one, some abstract form of labor, from the battlefield to the cloning laboratory, indicates that the separation which began with primitive accumulation appears now in the biotechnical determination to expropriate human beings. Capitalism has gone a long way since it, indifferent to life, was satisfied with nothing more than appropriating an excessive number of working hours. It is now engaged in the production of human workers. Conclusion. The essay has argued that primitive accumulation is a constantly reproduced accumulation, be it in terms of the renewed separation of new populations from the means of production and subsistence, or in terms of the reproduction of the wage relation and the established relations of capital. The former seeks to bring new workers under the command of capital, and the latter to contain them there as social categories freed from their conditions. The society of the free and equal, or the mode of production of associated producers, cannot be achieved through a politics on behalf of the working class. As Marx put it, to be a productive laborer is not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. Theory on behalf of the working class leads to the acceptance of programs and tickets whose common basis is the everyday religion of bourgeois society, commodity fetishism. The emancipation of the working class can only be achieved by the working class itself, and this means the transcendence of the working class as a class, and with it all classes. Marx called this transcendence of the working class as a social class by one name, communism. Emancipation means human emancipation. Communism entails the end of class, a classless society. The emancipation of the working class then means that man recognizes and organizes his forces proper as social forces, and thus no longer separates social forces from himself in the form of political forces and material forces. Marx saw this new form of society anticipated in the community of revolutionary proletarians who extend their own control over the conditions of their own existence, and thus of all members of society. It is as individuals that the individuals participate in it. It is exactly this combination of individuals, assuming the advanced stage of modern productive forces, of course, which puts the conditions of the free development and movement of individuals under their control. Conditions which were previously abandoned to chance and had won an independent existence over and against the separate individuals precisely because of their separation as individuals. Paraphrasing Adorno, full employment makes sense in a society where labor is no longer the measure of all things. In other words, then, and as this essay has argued, the labor theory of value presupposes the separation of human social practice from its conditions. It is this presupposition that constitutes a capitalist exploitation of labor, and it is this presupposition that the struggle for human emancipation is about. Human cooperation has to be liberated from the antagonistic relations of capital. Better, it has to emancipate itself from its capitalist form in order to assert itself as human cooperation who, no longer ruled by their own produced abstractions, control their own social conditions in existence. In short, for humans to enter into a relationship with one another, not as separate individuals whose social existence is made manifest behind their backs through the commodity form, but as social individuals, as human dignities who are in control of their social conditions, the economic mastery of capital over man has to be abolished so that man's social reproduction is controlled by him. Within capitalism, cooperation is a contradictory productive force. Not only have we here an increase in the productive power of the individual by means of cooperation, but the creation of a new power, namely the collective power of the masses. It is of course a case that the critique of political economy can be made manifest in practice only when it has seized the masses. When, in other words, the masses are seized by the understanding that it is their own labor, their social practice, that produces a world that oppresses them. This world is a world of separation, of object-less labor. What needs to be overcome then is the alienation of human social practice from her conditions. It is this alienation that constitutes the relationship between wage labor and capital. In sum, the struggle for human autonomy and self-determination entails a transformation of the means of production into means of emancipation.